This is the Animal Agenda on KPFK. I'm Tom Kiesche, and today we're chatting with Arnold Schouten of Dry Creek Waterfowl Sanctuary. He and his wife Debbie moved westward and started keeping waterfowl in the Pacific Northwest in 1976. Dry Creek Waterfowl Sanctuary was founded in 1980 by both Arnold and Debbie Schouten. Over the decades, Arnold has had many articles published and has spoken at many conferences and meetings. He has received many awards, including the International Wild Waterfowl Association Hall of Fame Award, the Masters Breeders Award from the American Pheasant and Waterfowl Society, and the Audubon Society Conservation Award. Before we start with questions, let me get my disclaimers out of the way. I am speaking and asking questions as an individual in my own individual capacity. My late uncle, Paul Dye, was a waterfowl expert for decades. I visited and volunteered at his Washington State waterfowl farm a few times, and while I didn't have a platform at that time to interview him, recently I was referred to Arnold through my Aunt Lynn, my late uncle's wife, as Arnold and Paul were not only waterfowl experts in the same geographical area who met in 1976, but they became good friends. So this is already a very special interview for me. I will also state that Dry Creek Waterfowl is a private sanctuary that is not open to the public. They provide waterfowl for zoos, private facilities, education, reintroduction, and non-lethal research. Hello, Arnold Schouten. Thank you for being here.
Hello, Tom. Thank you for having me.
Is there anything that I said that needs to be clarified or you want to fill in a little bit better?
No, I think you did great. Thank you.
So can you expand upon education, reintroduction, and non-lethal research?
Sure. Education, we make our facility available for Audubon groups, homeschool groups, public school students, environmental fundraising activities. But as you mentioned, we're not open to the public. So since we also live at this residence, we really do still appreciate our privacy. As far as research goes, there's a lot that isn't known about this group of waterfowl in the wild. And by having some in captivity, we can look at some of their unique habits as far as their natural survival, but also there's a lot of research that's being done with transmitters to understand where these birds go and what their habitat needs are. And if you put a transmitter on a wild bird and that bird is released, sometimes you don't get the transmitter back or something happens to the bird and you don't know if it was affected by having a transmitter on it. So by using the transmitters on captive birds, we can determine whether or not it's putting any wild birds at jeopardy, and also an opportunity to look at the longevity of the transmitter. So that's just a few of the things that happen here.
So you mentioned in our upfront interview that buoyancy was something that you looked at. Can you explain that?
Well, a transmitter can impact all of these birds are diving birds. They either forage by eating fish or clams and mussels, and they need to be able to dive very efficiently. And if they're catching fish, they can't be impaired by anything that would obstruct their movement. And a transmitter can impact diving ability and also at times flying ability. So by testing them in captivity, it's a way of assessing whether or not there's any physical impact to that bird's ability to forage in the wild.
And as far as reintroduction, can you explain how you help with reintroduction?
That's something that has had very limited use for us, or even in other cases for waterfowl in the wild. You cannot take a bird that's raised in captivity and put it out into the wild for several reasons. One is it may be bringing some kind of a parasite or disease to the wild population that we're not aware of, but also this is a captive bird that doesn't have all of its natural feeding abilities. So if, in fact, there is reintroduction, it's typically done through eggs that are fostered out to wild birds and then reared in their native natural environment. So it's only been experimented with in a very limited capacity at this point.
So I didn't mention that you supply restaurants with waterfowl or ducks. What's the answer there?
Well, of course we don't. These birds are too valuable and too rare. And those birds are all raised in more of a farm environment. And our environment is as natural as possible and as comfortable as possible for our birds.
Do you want to jump in and just say what birds you have on your farm or sanctuary currently?
Sure. We have at the top of the list the long-tailed duck, which is my favorite duck, and then followed by 4 species of eiders, which is the king eider, spectacled eider, Steller's eider, and Pacific eider. Harlequin ducks, mergansers include scaly-sided merganser, red-breasted merganser, smew, hooded merganser, and we also keep buffleheads and smew, which is that's a Eurasian merganser, and 3 species of shorebirds, which is not a primary focus, but just something that we really enjoy working with, and they're irresistible birds, and that's the pied avocet, collared pratt and call, and black-necked stilt.
So is Dry Creek a dry creek?
No, unfortunately, it's a little confusing. We live on what's called Dry Hill, which is mostly state DNR forest lands, and Dry Creek originates at the top of Dry Hill and flows out to the Straits of Juan de Fuca. So it is a drainage that it has a year-round creek and passes through our property.
Let's talk about your property for a second. I read in one of your past interviews that you had nearly 300 ducks, 15 ponds, and 2 miles of looping trails. Is that accurate to date?
Well, actually, we've acquired some more property, so the trails are a little over 5 miles now, but everything else is pretty accurate, yes.
Okay, let's go back to Long Island. Why waterfowl, and what first got you hooked?
Good question. I actually started out with fur-bearing animals and reptiles and amphibians, and growing up on Long Island as a child, the east end of Long Island was not very developed and still had lots of wetlands, lots of waterfowl habitat. And being a surfer on the island and being in the water all the time, I just had an attraction to ducks, particularly because they can live in such diverse environments. And being a water user myself, I always appreciated them being in that environment near me, and I was close to them. So it just grew as a real interest for me to work with ducks rather than some of the other species I previously worked with.
I find it interesting that my Uncle Paul started in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, finding ducks in the Meadowlands before that was all built up, and you're from Long Island, which obviously has become more built up, and you both went to the Pacific Northwest. So you all met in 1976. Was that just a coincidence, or tell me about that meeting?
Well, we had a common friend, Charles Pilling, known as Chuck Pilling, who really was a mentor to both of us. And through Chuck, who I had learned about before I knew of Paul, he referred me to Paul. He said, "Oh, you need to get to know Paul Dye." And so we got in touch with each other, as you said, in 1976, and I got some birds from him, and we just started working together on bird projects and just became really good friends. And beyond the birds, we would go skiing together and bike riding and hiking. So, it developed into a great long-term friendship.
And what is your education regarding waterfowl? You mentioned mentoring, but do you have any formal training?
Not in waterfowl, not at all. I've actually have a construction background, but it's just trial and error and talking to other people and being a member of a couple different organizations, especially the International Wild Waterfowl Association. It's an opportunity to get together with like-minded people, and since it is international, I know a lot of people in Europe that have birds, and we can compare notes and experiences, and it's a good reason to go travel. We just got back from Belgium, where we had a waterfowl conference this year, and so we got to see a lot of our European friends.
This is the Animal Agenda on KPFK. I'm Tom Kiesche, and today we're chatting with Arnold Schouten of Dry Creek Waterfowl Sanctuary. We're talking about waterfowl and, duck, geese. So You mentioned trial and error. Have you made any errors over the years that you've learned from that you would like to share on the radio?
Wow, that's a good question. I guess, when you build an enclosure for waterfowl, my father used to say, if you don't have time to do it right the first time, when are you going to have time to do it right the second time? So what I have learned is that you better put a lot of forethought into construction of the enclosures, idea being to provide the maximum security for your birds, but additionally, to keep out the predators. If the enclosure is adequate, you don't need to feel like you have to eliminate the predators in your area because they're native species. And if you want to work on behalf of birds' well-being in the wild, why would you want to eliminate all the natural predators in your area? So it's better to think ahead, build adequate enclosures that protect your birds without having to eliminate other species that live on the same property as you. And then additionally, waterfowl enclosures, any bird enclosures, aviaries, are kind of like closets. They can get filled up way too fast with too much stuff. So you need to stay focused on, make a decision about species, which was hard to do it initially because when you see a bird you really like, oh, that'd be fun to have a bird like that. You just need to stay focused and try to work with a smaller group, but work well with that group.
So you mentioned enclosures, which is a cost, and you mentioned predators. I know Paul used to have peacocks roaming his land, and he used to call them his natural alarms about predators. Do you have anything like that? Peacocks walking around?
No peacocks. No, they're a little loud and they tend to reproduce rather prolifically. So no, we don't have any, non-native species walking around the property.
In 1985, the Arco Anchorage, carrying 814,000 barrels of Alaskan crude oil, ran aground as it entered Port Angeles Harbor. How did that influence your path?
That made a really big impression on me and definitely gave us the direction we've gone in today. My wife and I were responders to that oil spill, and that was in the early stages of oil spill response. So we had hundreds of oil-covered birds show up at a care center that we actually were using the Port Angeles High School as a care center because it was during Christmas break. And here we had hundreds of birds, and it was just, we really, as a community, didn't know how to clean these birds. So the director of the International Bird Rescue Center came to Port Angeles, and she taught us how to clean the birds. And it was amazing how many people turned out. It was a round-the-clock operation. And unfortunately, a very small percentage of the birds were released back to the wild. But out of that, I realized that instead of having birds in captivity just to have them as pets, so to speak, we wanted to have birds in captivity that could benefit the wild populations. And so that group of sea ducks, which we have now, were little represented in captivity and little known as far as a lot of their natural history here in the Pacific Northwest. So we closed out most of our collections of species we had, got permits to go to the Arctic and collect eggs. We brought the eggs back in partnership with your Uncle Paul, and we raised those birds in captivity, and that became the nucleus of the breeding stock we have today. Later on, we got a reputation for working with these species, and so Fish and Wildlife and other facilities, institutions asked us to expand the species collection, and so collectively we work together to expand to the group we have today. And so that's what we're known for, is working with this group of waterfowl that generally lives in the marine environment and comes to freshwater only to breed.
So without mentioning the brand name, do people actually clean wild waterfowl with dish detergent?
Yes, and it's good. I'm comfortable naming the brand name because of the fact that if any oil spill now, they donate the detergent for the oil spill response, and it's been the only effective cleaner that's been found to date.
I did not know I was going to get that answer. I love that. You mentioned the Arctic, visiting with my uncle, getting permits to collect eggs. I've also heard that you visited the Amazon. So what is the importance of visiting geographical areas like that? And what is the impact on you with such excursions?
Well, it's important because we can better understand the life cycle of these birds. Also, it's still magnificent to see them in their native habitat and flying and enjoying their life where they live. But it's just the experience of going somewhere you've never been before, like the Amazon, and seeing torrent ducks living in the fast-moving rivers. It's just, you can't in any way really feel it other than being there.
One of my trips to my uncle's farm, I helped him for 2 weeks build waterfall runs for harlequin ducks. So I think seeing them in nature inspired him to think of a new way to try to get them to breed. Were you aware of that project, and have you had similar projects of your own?
I was very aware of that project. I'd even been by there a few times while I was constructing the enclosures, and we have done the same thing ourselves. We have a waterfall enclosure that was designed specifically for the harlequin duck, which is a duck that breeds in fast-moving rivers and streams and raises its young in fairly fast-moving water. And other than that period of time when they're young on the river or the breeding on the river, they're out in the marine environment. So it's a pretty unique bird and a very hardy bird that can live in pretty unusual conditions when you consider a duckling in a fast-moving river.
What were the eggs that you collected in the Arctic?
At the time, our permits allowed us to collect some eider species, longtails, brant geese, and that was the extent of our permit. The eiders, longtails, and brant.
So I'm going to get this a little wrong, probably, because I'm just remembering from what I was told. But my Aunt Lynn told me that my Uncle Paul's favorite birds were the brant geese because they sort of get bullied by other species or other geese. She told me that her favorite duck was the ruddy duck. And because they fight and defend their young, and they'll like clamp on your finger to defend their nest. You said you like the long-tailed duck, and I heard that that's one of the hardest species to breed or to work with. So my question on this is, does the person's favorite wild waterfowl mean anything about the person whose favorite wild waterfowl it is?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that question. I know why I like the long-tailed duck, but
why do you like the long-tailed duck?
It's the deepest diving duck. It can dive to 220 feet. It's the only duck that has three plumages. Typically, a duck has an eclipse plumage and a breeding plumage, and a long-tailed duck has an eclipse plumage, a breeding plumage, and a winter plumage. And it is a duck that's very difficult to work with in captivity. And we've had some very good success over the years. So it's just one that I find incredibly amazing, and I never get tired of it. And it has a beautiful courtship call.
I have to ask what that is.
I can't replicate it, but check it out on the video.
Okay, let's go there. If I was someone who wanted to know more about these ducks that we're talking about, or waterfowl, where would I look?
There's a great organization called the Sea Duck Joint Venture, and if you look at their website, they usually have a good description of each one of the sea ducks, because they are specifically an organization that collects all of the current research on sea ducks, does a lot of the census work on sea ducks, and has a conference every few years where they pull together all the best scientists relative to sea duck research. That's a good place to look. In general, for waterfowl, the International Wild Waterfowl Association website has a lot of information. And there are people all over the country that do work with birds in captivity. And maybe in your area, there might be someone that, wants to share what they know, or share their facility as a place to go see birds up close in person. And of course, San Diego Zoo has an excellent waterfowl collection. So some of the zoos have some really nice collections of waterfowl.
You're listening to The Animal Agenda on KPFK. I'm Tom Kiesche, and today we have wildfowl expert Arnold Schouten from Dry Creek Waterfowl Sanctuary. And I said wildfowl because that was what my uncle used to call his farm, a wildfowl farm. What's the difference between a wildfowl farm and a waterfowl farm?
Technically nothing. That was Paul's choice of wording.
So when I was working on that Harlequin enclosure with the waterfalls, I met two different kinds of birds, and they both had very unique personalities. I met a dancing crane who was very friendly with me. He wanted to literally dance with me, came up to me every time I was there, wanted to jump up and down, flap his wings, and play with me. And a trumpeter swan. I can't remember if it was a male or female trumpeter swan, but I learned a couple really interesting things. One, I was told that if I went back to the farm in a year or even a couple months, that my relationship with the dancing crane would change because the dancing crane would reach sexual maturity. The second thing, the trumpeter swan was so connected with me that I was told if I was at that farm for a period of time, I would have to, quote unquote, break up with the trumpeter swan because the trumpeter swan would not mate or take a mate with a tight relationship with a human. What are some quirks like that that you have encountered over the years?
Well, it's we tend to, when we work with birds and animals in general, we want it, if they're cuddly or you want to hold them, you want to get real personal with them. But at some point, you don't want them to imprint on you so they won't choose a mate of their own species. And that you don't want, it's nice to have them very tame. But if you really want to have production, if that's your goal with these species in captivity, then you don't want them to imprint on people. And I remember that dancing crane. It was a sandhill crane, and he was very imprinted, as that's the expression. When you just have them so close to you that they think they're more human than they are bird. So we have some birds that are favorites that follow us around, and we name maybe 5% of our birds, but typically if they're too imprinted, they don't contribute to the breeding population. So that's something to be cautious about. You don't want them to lose all of their natural instincts and habits. Do
waterfowl have individual personalities?
Definitely. There are unique individuals, without a doubt. And there's males and females that have unique traits about them, and I'm sure that it's not unique to the captive flock. I think but if you could be as intimately close to them in the wild, you would find that to be the case in the wild also.
I apologize if you hear bells. There's a church in my neighborhood that plays bells every once in a while. I don't know if you hear those or not, but we're going to continue. What kind of questions do you think the future generations will be or should be looking for regarding waterfowl?
What was it like 30, 40 years ago? When you start talking about some species that, there's species that people think are just a rare sighting now that were very common. I remember prior to the 1985 oil spill here in Port Angeles, we had many, many more birds in the harbor, in the straits, in the outer straits, and out on the coast. So quite a few bird species in that marine environment have declined in population. So I hope that someday that individuals that are out bird watching and taking in the environment will be able to see the numbers we saw at one time. And I think that we just need to leave behind as many healthy populations of native species as we can.
What can the general public do to help the native species in the wild?
Yeah, well, they can, if they live along the coast, they can go out and do beach cleanups, pick up trash off the beaches, because everything that ends up in the marine environment has some impact on the wildlife, especially plastics. They can learn about water quality and how they can impact the quality of whether it's freshwater lakes, rivers, streams, or the marine nearshore or the ocean at large. we all can impact it in some way by the way we live. You know, the expression is we all live upstream, so everything ends up in our oceans. So anything we can do in our homes that can impact the environment, we should be well aware of and work hard toward protecting it or improving it at this point.
Oil, detergent, fishing lines, plastics, microplastics, rubber from tires. What else am I missing?
Well, you've covered it well, but there's probably a lot of other things we're not thinking of together right now, but it's just the point being we should all know how we impact the health of the environment. And a lot of things are very easy to do. You know, we just have to know where our trash goes. If we can recycle, we should recycle. And if people live near the coast or are going to visit the coast, they should check out the Surfrider Foundation and look at some of the projects they do, because there's almost always some beach cleanup or some project going on by Surfrider on behalf of the ocean and ocean health.
Okay. Extended time. I got some more questions for you.
Okay.
I remember shoveling poop out of enclosures and inoculating ducks. What are some of the daily tasks and daily costs of a farm like yours?
The daily tasks include cleaning ponds. We have enough ponds in our enclosures that we have a regular cleaning schedule. We do have someone that lives at our place who works for us full time, and has a schedule where she cleans ponds. We have from time to time birds that need medication or physical checks, so we have a schedule where we need to look at a specific individual. And during breeding season, it gets very, very busy here. We're handling ducklings, we're weighing them, they're putting bands on them, we're moving them up to various size enclosures as they grow. And we're checking nests, checking eggs. So, and then of course each enclosure has to be mowed, cleaned out, trees and shrubs need to be pruned. So it really is pretty much a full-time job. And we do put a lot of emphasis on the quality of the enclosures and also the cleanliness and appearance. So it needs to be welcoming to the birds and to ourselves and our visitors.
3 things. How do you clean a pond? How do you keep track of all the birds so you make sure they get treatment individually? And how do you find help for doing that if you're not a 501c3 nonprofit?
Okay, so the pond, they're all concrete with a drain in them. And so we pull the plug, drain it out on the property so it filters into the ground, and then they get swept out, hosed out, if need be, pressure washed, and then refilled. And so most every pond gets cleaned at least once every 2 weeks. Some get cleaned more often. So that in itself is very time consuming. Your second question?
How do you keep the ducks, track of the ducks individually?
Very good. Okay, so when the ducklings reach a certain age, usually from a week to 2 weeks of age, they get a seamless metal band, a stainless steel seamless metal band that goes on their leg, and then the leg grows to a size where the band will never come off, so it's with them for life, and it's sized by species, so it doesn't get too tight. At that point, they're identified as an individual. We keep record of their lineage. We know their age. And if a bird leaves here, we record who got the bird, and the bird stays with us. It gets a health chart. It gets a physical twice a year. It gets treated prophylactically for parasites. You mentioned your Uncle Paul using a vaccine. We perfected in the early 90s a vaccine for aspergillosis, which these sea ducks have a susceptibility to. So we vaccinate all our birds, and it has worked out to be very effective. And that's done, as I said, twice a year. So we know each individual's handled at least twice a year with that physical. And then, as I said, if they leave here, we know where they went.
As far as help from the outside, is that possible at your farm?
Well, when we do what we call duck days, we have 8 volunteers that come and help us, and it takes us a day and a half to catch all the birds and handle them. As far as full-time help, we were fortunate enough to find someone who had a passion for birds and wanted to live here on the property And it was just actually we were looking for someone to be a gamekeeper, and it was sort of a very lucky coincidence that we ran into this person, and she's done a great job for us.
While researching this interview, I chatted with my Aunt Lynn, and I asked her some questions. She said the number one question that her and Paul would get when people visited their farm was, do ducks mate for life? What's the answer to that?
So typically not, but there are some species that do. And the harlequin duck mates for life, and which is kind of unique because, as I mentioned earlier, they nest on fast-moving streams. So the male will go up the river with the female. She chooses her nest site. They breed. Once she starts sitting on eggs, he leaves and he goes out to the nearshore environment and molts. And then she rears the young in the river until they're flighted. And then she goes and joins the male and molts, and they spend the winter together. That's unique for ducks. It's more typical that geese and swans mate for life. Not many duck species do. Although in captivity, since they're in close proximity to each other, they seem to end up with the same mate year after year, but that's not typical of wild birds. Wild birds migrate great distances in really big flocks, often especially like eiders and longtails, so they're not as likely to mate for life.
Why are the males typically more colorful?
Distraction mostly, and attraction. So the males are chosen somewhat by the female by his appearance, but then also when if you notice, most of the females, when they're sitting on the eggs, especially ground nesting birds, they almost blend in with the environment. So for the female, it's a bit of camouflage. For the male, it's to act as a distraction and also an attraction to the females.
So of all the questions you've received over the years, what's the question that you've heard the most?
What kind of bird is that? What kind of duck is that? And so, these are birds you can't see very easily in the wild. They live in the far north, and some of them migrate into the open sea where they're not going to come near shore. And this is an opportunity for people to see the uniqueness of them and learn a lot about them and their natural environment.
Arnold, it's been a delight to have you on, to get to know you, to reminisce about my Uncle Paul's farm, to learn about waterfowl, your sanctuary. If there was a question you wished more people would ask, what would that be?
What can I do to help these wild populations survive, increase, and live in a healthy environment?
Okay. I feel like we touched on that earlier. Let's answer that very clearly right now.
Go to organizations that work with the birds of your interest and learn more about them, learn more about the marine environment or the breeding habitat of the birds, and then see what you can do to help improve those places.
Thank you, Arnold, for coming on today.
Thank you, Tom.
My name is Tom Kiesche, and you've been listening to The Animal Agenda on KPFK, 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. We're streaming online at kpfk.org every Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Our guest this week has been Arnold Schouten of Dry Creek Waterfowl Sanctuary. Lastly, let me state it one more time, they are not open to the public. Special thanks to producer Marlena Bond. If you have any questions, suggestions, or want to know more, write comments at kpfk.org or check out the Animal Agenda's Facebook page. You can listen to the past episodes at the kpfk.org archives for 59 days after airing, or find them and potentially extended interviews on the Animal Agenda's SoundCloud page. Thank you again, Arnold.